I'm Dr. John Kruse, and today I'm going to be talking about the LGBTQ ADHD connection. And yes, there is one. So the take-home message, I just gave it away in one word. Yes, there is an association between individuals who are on the LGBT spectrum are more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. Individuals with ADHD are more likely to identify as being on the LGBTQ spectrum. There's actually a stronger connection or association between ADHD and same-sex behavior than there is between self-identified same-sex orientation, but they're both found in most studies. And this association between transgender and ADHD is actually more consistent in that every study, at least in one meta-analysis that's looked at it, is found an association. There are at least a few studies that fail to find sexual orientation, ADHD connection, and a few studies hasn't been found. In some of those, there was a marked difference between the two groups, but the sample sizes were too small. Actually, a whole range of what some may call neurodivergence characteristics are associated with each other. So I'm talking about autism spectrum disorders, ADHD, left-handedness, LGBTQ-ness, and autoimmune disorders. If you have one on that list, you are more likely than someone from the general population to have another characteristic from that list. Why they go together is unclear, but there's clearly important, probably biological as well as social information that I think merits looking at. So why would we be looking at this question? One is that if you're not aware of these associations, you may be confounding your studies with what may be confusing information. So if you think you're looking at the difference between adult women with ADHD and women without ADHD, and you don't know that the ADHD population has a higher percentage of non-heterosexual women in it, and that there are aspects of non-heterosexuality that affect brain morphology, shape, size, connections, then you may find a difference that's actually attributable to sexual orientation, whereas your interpretation is that you chose for ADHD, so that's what the differences are going to be based on. So there's research important issues for why it's important to address or be aware of the association here. There are also a range of issues regarding the stigmatization, access to healthcare, access to other societal resources. It's important to know if these conditions are more likely to be found together. And particularly, there's a good study by Teddy Getz and Noah Adams that was looking at the nexus between gender diverse and attention deficit ADHD. And their big message is that if you have ADHD, it's going to be more difficult to navigate the very complicated, multi-step, arduous process legally and medically to get some of the care you may desire or need. I will make a disclaimer. So I do have family members with ADHD. I have extended family members with ADHD and on the LGBTQ spectrum. I'm gay myself. So I am trying to use a respectful terminology throughout the day, but I'm aware that terms and terminology is changing. So if I'm insulting anyone, please correct me or say what terms you prefer. I'm trying to approach both of these topics from one of neurodiversity and not pathologizing either variable, either the ADHD, although officially it is a disease. But I fundamentally see both ADHD and LGBTQ spectrum issues as aspects of these are individuals who are different than the majority, but that does not imply a deficit or an illness. There's been a fair amount of research on ADHD and sexuality in general. Those with ADHD are more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, starting sex at younger ages, having more partners, having more STDs, having a higher likelihood of being parents at a young age. Some studies haven't found this, but I'd say overall there's pretty consistent, and it's interesting that the difference is actually more noticeable in many studies for women than for men. So part of it is that men in general tend to be engaging in more risky sex practices. So the differential between ADHD and non-ADHD men is less distinct than for women with or without ADHD. And there's fewer studies on sexual orientation ADHD. There's several difficulties involved in studies looking at this. One is that most of the studies are using categorical, sort of simple, does someone have ADHD or not? Or are they heterosexual or not? Whereas ADHD and sexual orientation exist on spectrums. And if you're using an arbitrary cutoff for ADHD symptoms, you may actually have people with considerable ADHD symptomatology in your non-ADHD group. Another problem is both these categories, even though it's much less so than 30 years ago or 60 years ago, both ADHD and LGBTQ identities are stigmatized. And that means some individuals may not want to disclose their identity either to a health professional or to a online survey taker. Again, hopefully we are working to reduce some of that stigma, but it's still there. I mean, there are case reports and other studies done that way. But the two research studies are based on either electronic health records, looking at what results, what diagnoses have been entered into the chart. What's problematic there is that, one, it's often not clear what criteria the clinicians were using when they decided someone had an ADHD diagnosis or indicate in the chart that this was a non-heterosexual orientation or a non-binary gender identity. So one of the interesting things is that most of the studies looking at EHR records have rates of ADHD in the adult population around 1%. I mean, already there, that's telling you that they are missing probably at least 3/4 of the ADHD population. Reasons for that is the clinicians may simply be missing the diagnosis. They may be aware of the diagnosis, but reluctant to put it in the record, either because the person also has depression or something else that's being treated, or because they didn't want to include what they felt might be stigmatizing or other clinicians may interpret differently, or individual may be seeking their mental health and or sexual health treatment outside of the EHR. So within the EHR, they may be treated for when they get COVID, when they break their leg, but they may decide to go to a specialist outside of their system for ADHD or gender care, again, based on either actual or perceived views that they would get inferior care within the system. So the EHR records gives us big numbers to play with in terms of the diagnoses or label being given by a evaluator rather than the individual. So the other type of studies look at online recruiting through social media and are more survey-based. So one of the problems there is depending on how they actually recruited volunteers for the study. And if they went to an ADHD chat room, then they're going to get people with ADHD, but whether that's a random selection of the ADHD community is questionable. And or if they went to LGBT-friendly sites, you're going to have population certainly enriched in that variable. But if they went to other sites, they may not. Interesting recent survey was released, found that among the online gaming community, 28% were in the LGBTQ community. If you were just studying or looking at gamers as a way to recruit people into your study, you're going to be already overrepresented with people in the LGBT community. And actually, there's other studies showing that ADHD is overrepresented in that community. Other aspects of the social media studies are they're based on self-reports. So someone may either exaggerate symptoms or claim something they don't have, or may just underreport or hide things if they feel they're maybe stigmatized or penalized for having that. Benefit, though, of some of the social media studies are that the researchers, depending on the study design, can actually test more clearly. So they can administer questionnaires to more precisely see or at least meet certain criteria for having ADHD or sexual orientation. So what do some of the studies show? And I'm going to pick on two of the more recent. These are both online surveys, one done by Hertz and her colleagues in Germany. People with ADHD were twice as likely as those without ADHD to report having same-sex experiences. And women, that was 57% of women with ADHD reported having same-sex experiences versus only 33, a third of the non-ADHD women reported that. So that's about double the rate. In men, both groups with ADHD and without reported less likelihood of engaging in same-sex responses. And the difference there was a five-fold difference. So men with ADHD, a quarter of them acknowledged having same-sex sexual experiences, where only 5% of the non-ADHD men acknowledged that. So that's based on behavior, but based on identity, those who self-identified, there are also substantial differences. Among the women, fully a third of the women with ADHD identifying as non-heterosexual, whereas of the non-ADHD women, only a quarter of them. And with men, 90% of the men were identifying as heterosexual, but 10% were acknowledging a non-heterosexual orientation. And among the ADHD population, it was twice as high, 20%. Young and her colleagues published a 2023 study looking at, I believe it was largely a British population. And there they found among women, again, similar rates, non-ADHD women, about a quarter, 25% reported non-heterosexual sexual orientation, whereas fully 41% of women with ADHD reported non-heterosexual orientation. And among men, again, lower rates overall, but 20% of the non-ADHD males acknowledged a non-heterosexual orientation, whereas fully a third, 33% of the ADHD males were acknowledging as such. So again, there have been some exceptions. There have been some studies with differences that didn't meet statistical significance, but the data is pretty, as a consensus, that there are, among those with ADHD, you have higher rates of people who identify as LGBTQ. And if you look at the LGBT population, more of them are embracing or acknowledging an ADHD diagnosis than the heteronormative sexual world. And the trans data, smaller number of studies, smaller people in most of the studies. There, though, every single study, at least it was summarized in an article by Getz and Adams, every study found higher rates of ADHD among the transsexual population compared to non-trans, transgender population. And if you're looking at it from the other angle, higher rates among those with ADHD, higher rates identifying as trans. And the EHR record studies, again, the problems with diagnoses I mentioned earlier, but fairly consistency, the rates of having ADHD were 5 to 10 times higher among the trans population than among non-trans cisgender populations. So the association is there. What does it mean? Or one is, why would we compare? Why would we concern about it at all? Why is this relevant? Why would we be poking in people's sexual lives? And one answer I alluded to in the take-home message is that this introduces significant confounding problems in some of the research. So if a substantially higher percentage of your individuals with ADHD are LGBTQ, and we know that other studies have found some differences in brain symmetry. Some same-sex attracted women have brains that look more male than compared to the non-lesbian population. Well, again, if you think you're doing a study on women with ADHD and you're not aware that you may have a disproportionate number of lesbians in your population, then you may attribute any differences you find purely to the ADHD when some of them may be attributable to other factors. even though much of the research is focused in sort of a pathologizing way as to what's wrong with ADHD brains, that they're different than the general population, what's wrong with trans brains, that they're different than the normal population, I think the more basic question to be looking at is we still don't know what in our brains leads us to identify our gender. We don't know what in our brains leads us to be attracted to certain sexual partners or not. So both questions of gender, sexual orientation, and the origins of ADHD or non-ADHD style of thinking. We don't know any of these things, but looking what's in a hetero brain that makes a man choose a woman or a woman choose a man. All of those, I think, are interesting biological and brain functional questions that, again, if we're aware of associations, they shed some potential light on looking at those questions. Third angle is that we know from a variety of data that there are increasing rates, at least of identification and diagnoses of both ADHD and LGBTQ identities. Is this because society is just becoming more tolerant and more people are free to express who they really are? Or is it a sign that there's some environmental toxins or changes in our environment, particularly plastics, which may be feminizing or estrogenizing certain parts of the brain, whether estrogen is, even though it's a female hormone, it is responsible for the masculinization of the brain. So we have to be careful how we are using gender terms with sexual steroids, sexual hormones. Some of the studies looked at the concept of minority stress, and I'm going to use the term minoritized stress. The difference there is that if you're a member of the minority group, that is implying that the majority group has deemed you different, defective, weird, but it's not. It's giving you a label and an identity without acknowledging that that label is coming from the major group in power, whereas more minoritized emphasizes that this is a power dynamic and usually a judgmental separation between us and them. Anyway, minority stress is the concept that if you are in a stigmatized group, if you have ADHD or you are on the LGBT spectrum, and if you have more than one, including a racial minority mixed in there, or an immigration status situation, you're likely to undergo even more social stress, and that may have an impact on certainly the development of mental health conditions like depression, anxiety, and some studies, maybe even more severity of ADHD symptoms. So being aware of association between stigmatized, minoritized identities is important. There is a convergence of some of these neurodiversity. Again, that does not mean everyone with ADHD is on the autism spectrum and is LGBTQ or left-handed, but all of these run together. Are there common causes? Why are we seeing this overrepresentation? And I would broaden it beyond just neurodiverse, because all of these conditions, including left-handedness, are also linked with higher rates of having autoimmune conditions. So it's really a neuropsycho-immunodiverse community we're talking about here. So getting that, we talked a little bit about minoritized stress and social determinants or factors here. One target that's been looked at a lot is androgen exposure, particularly prenatally. One of my previous talks on testosterone in the brain and ADHD, we know from finger-length studies, which are a fairly good reflection of androgen exposure in vitro. There's other measures of androgen exposure in utero during development, during pregnancy. So there's something called autoacoustic emissions of your cochlea. So your inner ear is actually making tiny, tiny little noises. Most people are completely unaware of that. Some people may be able to hear them, but that is something that's subject to prenatal androgens, so that it actually suppresses or makes that less pronounced. There, again, are ways of measuring prenatal androgen exposure that are simple, objective, non-invasive techniques, autism spectrum, ADHD, significant skewing by most studies towards males, LGBTQ, there's some suggestive evidence, even though we do not know the origins of sexual orientation, that exposure to prenatal androgens and maybe estrogens as well can affect that. Biggest point from the Getz and Adams study is that it's important to be aware in the trans community of a significantly increased rate of people with ADHD, because even in the states which are happy to let people express their own identities and live their own biological realities, lots of intricate steps to navigate healthcare. There's lots of intricate steps to get governmental recognition of changes of driver's license and other things for gender changes. And if you're not aware that lots of your population is dealing with ADHD, and you just say, hey, take that form into the DMV and it'll be easy, and these people are going to need more support and structure to help navigate those. So I will encourage you to be healthy and happy and safe, and I will be back next week.